like a plant, right? And so the kind of philosophy that he represents really is very organic, very close to the kind of philosophy that the eco movement, the ecological movement is associated with. The idea that we should think about, the plastics that we create and then throw out are going to become part of the environment out there. And what is that going to do to the environment? We have to think about that. We have to think about the carbon footprint, all these interactions that we've got with the universe. We've become urban. We create all these urban cities and things, and as a result of the urbanization of the planet, we end up with less and less of nature out there. And the thing is, nature is us, so we can't get rid of us. We won't be here anymore. What's going to happen if we keep this up? Hegel's other roommate was Hölderlin. Who was a poet, became one of the most famous German poets. And once he got old enough, he sort of went crazy and lived in an apartment up above the river in Tübingen, and I think he stayed in Tübingen. Maybe he goes somewhere else. I forget. But in any case, his poems are still out there, and some of them are really kind of amazing. But I don't know. It might make you crazy if you read them. So it might not be a good thing to read them. Goethe is not, of course, one of the roommates. He's older, but he's kind of the leading influence in Germany at the time, and lives just a short distance from Jena. In fact, because of the university being there, he spent a lot of time in Jena, and so he's a very important part of that. And if you're reading Andrea Wolf's book, The Magnificent Rebels, he's kind of the main character that they are all coming to visit. But something I wanted to mention about them, not only about Schelling, who's involved in the book and very, very important in the book Magnificent Rebels, but both of the Humboldts are also part of that. And William Humboldt, the brother of Alexander, is a translator. And he's the one who translates Shakespeare from English into German. What you find out when you read Andrea Wolf's book is that it was actually William Humboldt's wife who did all the translation work, but as usual, the husband got all of the credit. But when she stopped translating because of childbirth and things, no books came out. So you had to wait until she was ready to work again and translate. So that's kind of it's a fascinating book. The neat thing about Andrea Wolf is that she goes into all of the letters, because they wrote letters to one another, to all the different individuals, and you could get a hold of these letters still in libraries and things in Germany doing your research. And as a result, you can trace the developments of ideas and who's doing what that you wouldn't hear otherwise. So it's absolutely fascinating. So the connection between this whole group of people, it included Schiller. By the way, Sturm und Drang. How many folks ever noticed that the school in book 4 is Durmstrang? That's just hilarious, because obviously J.K. Rowling is playing with that. What is Sturm und Drang, by the way? That's part of this romantic impulse. That what's important is having your emotions totally aimed at this specific goal in life. you just absolutely focused on that, even to the risk of your own life, and you want to accomplish whatever that specific thing is. And even if it's an evil thing, even if it's evil, you're actually kind of a hero in the Romantic movement because of the emphasis you put on that goal. So it's, you might even be an evil person, but you're still a hero because of the way I mean, think of Napoleon, how disruptive Napoleon was all across Europe, and yet he was clearly heroic in the eyes of the Romantic period. By the way, regarding the nature of women and how they were treated, I also want to throw in an important philosopher that usually doesn't get covered, but her name is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was actually a little earlier. Notice she's born in 1759. Hegel's born in 1770. And she dies 1797. Hegel dies in 1831. But she is interesting because of her book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Strictly speaking, feminism isn't known yet. It's not a movement, but she's ahead of the game, arguing that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. So if you give women education, you'll double the workforce of the society, because you'll have both men and women able to do all sorts of things. But she's also famous because her daughter, Mary Shelley, Mary became Shelley because she married thank you. I'm thinking Bryant. I'm getting my poets confused. But she married. Is that how you say it, Percy? Bis Shelley, whatever. She married him, and she also became famous because she wrote the book Frankenstein, which is kind of like the romantic novel. So if you think of, I think we think of it as Gothic, but in a sense it was like if you do an analysis of it and you can see what the connection is to Romanticism, that's like the ideal romantic novel. So that's pretty interesting, her relationship with different people, and fascinating. She should get more coverage. And Andrea, but Andrea is neat because she goes into the letters and discovers an awful lot of relationships are really the women that are coming up with so much of this stuff and translating and doing other things, and they don't get the coverage. It's because of the time. It's the males that get published, the women don't, and even though they're doing the work, that's kind of very frustrating for them. So we can get into remember my question, who was the world soul for Hegel? And of course, here's your answer right there, if you're thinking about the quiz. But you can, of course, explore the concept of the world soul. I might respond to whatever you say by asking, well, who do you think the world soul is today? And what on earth might that mean? Well, let's get into Hegel's philosophy and see how his he ends up let's see, do we want spirit or mind? What's going to come up? We'll go with this first. So he does write some things prior to writing this big book. Remember, this is the one that's half of it, the last half, is in the package in the painting with him standing there under saluting Napoleon and mailing it that day. And he did mail it that day, according to what he said. He had written some other things before, obviously, in school at Tübingen University. And as a member of the university at Jena, after his friend Schelling invites him to come and teach there. And the kinds of things that they're publishing are especially arguing over the nature of the Fichtean, remember, Gottlob Fichte, and Schelling philosophies. Because Schelling's philosophy is kind of piggybacking on Fichte. What kind of advance is he making, right? Why is Schelling's philosophy better than Fichte's? But along comes this book, where he turns out to have what he says is the better system than his friend Schelling's. So, of course, once this book comes out, the relationship between Schelling and Hegel is kind of messed up, because all along Schelling has been helping him out, pulling him along, and finally he gets to publish his book, and it turns out that he's kind of trumping Schelling's philosophy. So the argument between the two of them goes on for quite a few years. It doesn't really end, even though Hegel tries to reconcile with them, with Schelling, visits and spends time with him, but never really makes Schelling feel better about what happened. And the problem is going to happen when Hegel dies first. Hegel dies in 1831, and at the time, by the way, he was the chair of the Department of Philosophy in Berlin, and in fact the president of the University of Berlin. And that left the chair vacant. And for a couple of years they didn't have someone there, but they finally ended up filling the chair with Schelling. And so Schelling is the one that ends up replacing Hegel for quite a few years, actually. And while he's there, two students, for example, that come and study with Schelling are Kierkegaard and Marx. So you end up with Schelling teaching Hegel's philosophy as a stepping stone to his own, reversing the position that Hegel gives us. Well, actually, when we look at their philosophies, even though Schelling's philosophy is an interesting philosophy, still today very interesting, it's actually clearly a stepping stone to Hegel. So what is Hegel's philosophy? Well, when we're looking at what Kant has left us, and the emphasis on the Ich that Fichte gives us, Hegel's answer is to think of everything as organic. And when you think of organic things like a tree, the oak tree as the metaphor, you realize at what point does an oak tree become an oak tree? Initially we might say, okay, well, here's an acorn. Is that an oak tree yet? You say no, it's just an acorn, right? And you plant it, and maybe it'll sprout, and you have little green things sticking up. Is that an oak tree? No, not really, right? But then you end up with maybe a 6-foot sapling. You think, is this an oak tree? Well, we still call it a sapling, but yeah, it's an oak tree now, right? Then of course it becomes maybe full grown, right? And now you clearly say this is an oak tree. What happens when the oak tree gets hit by lightning and falls down in a forest where no one is there to hear it? And we end up with this dead oak tree now. Is it still an oak tree? Yes, but it is rotten and it's dying, or it's dead. It might have a few odd and then things growing off of it and so on, but mostly you're going to have mushrooms and bugs of all sorts and things just deteriorating it, eating it and putting it out of its misery, so to speak. Well, what's the point of this? It's not a clear-cut thing where oak tree-ness actually occurs. It's instead kind of a constant flow, like, if we go back to the idea of the river is the kind of thing you can't step into twice, because the second time the river is something different, right? So Heraclitus gives us this early metaphor for change, that you can never quite step into it twice, right? Change is a constant thing, and as a result of that, the idea that an object is a clear-cut specific thing is in a sense wrong. In fact, if we're going to try to define what an object is, we first have to notice that we're talking about language, and we're giving it a name. Remember, with Aristotle, you have multiple ways of talking about a horse, right? I drew that beautiful horse on the board for you. It's clearly a horse, right? And we have the word horse, and we have horse in the sense that a particular animal out in the yard that's a horse, right? But we might also have two horses, in which case we might think of the concept of horse as applying to both of them, and we end up having trouble, because is that a real thing? The horse that is the same as all horses, is that a real thing? No, it's just a concept, right? Plato might have thought it was even more real than the horses.